What up, what up? Mully is back, and welcome to the second of 3 matches from the 2014 batch for the Diamonds Are Forever series. I'm going up against SoAboutMySandwich. Nice name. Anyway, this is a DPP OU match. For those new to DPP OU, keep in mind that there is no team preview since it didn't exist in the Nintendo DS games. I want to give some background on my team before we start the game though. So back in 2013, there was a community create a team thread, or CCAT. It was created on the Smogon forums in the Runes of Al section, which is basically for past generations of Pokemon games. These threads show up for the current generations of games too, but this was for past gens at the time. Based on the name, you can guess what happens in those threads. We pick a generation, which in this case DPPOU won. Then we submit Pokemon that we would like to build a team with, one at a time, and then everyone votes, and whoever gets the most votes for each Pokemon wins. Now my pick for the first Pokemon was Swords Dance Venusaur, and there were a lot of other great mons that players suggested, but ultimately Substitute Calm Mind Raikou won the most votes submitted by the one and only BKC. Shout out to him. So since my pick didn't win, I decided to build my own team around Swords Dance Venusaur on the side while the CCAT was going on. Fun little fact, the CCAT was affectionately named the BKC Cat because too many of BKC's suggestions for teammates after Raikou was picked were winning the votes. But I got the team built. This turned out to be the result. So let's get right into the battle. As you guys can see, I'm leading with Crobat and my opponent has a Heatran lead. So there is a chance my opponent could go for Explosion straight up since lead Crobats tend to be standard stall breakers with taunt. But let's find out what happens. My opponent is actually going to end up staying in and try for the Stealth Rock, and I managed to catch it. But here I think I judged my opponent's level a bit too quickly based on keeping Heatran in because I immediately go to Swampert expecting the Fire Blast so I can set up Stealth Rock on turn 3. But my opponent explodes outright, and because Explosion does double damage in this gen, and I'm not running the standard tank spread, my Swampert dies and it's a double down, which this actually turns out to be pretty big, as you guys will see throughout the match. But I bring Crobat back in on the free switch since it's so early in the game to scout some more, and my opponent brings in Jirachi, which led me to believe this was a Choice Scarf set. Stallbreaker Crobat does have some bulk to it, so I felt safe to U-turn out here, but I didn't expect to stab Zen Headbutt at all. So I bring in my own Jirachi. Mine is also Choice Scarf, and I'm carrying U-turn as well, so I go for it expecting my opponent to hard switch to a Jirachi check or counter so I can maintain momentum. Gyarados gets revealed, which Jirachi is my check for, but at this point in the game, I do have another switch in for it, which is Zapdos. So I show it here. The leftovers on Gyarados here typically means that it is a Dragon Dance set, but I want to just keep scouting here. And Gyarados can be a threat if my opponent has the momentum, since the most common set was Dragon Dance at the time. So I just go for Thunderbolt. Of course my opponent switches out and reveals the be-all end-all counter to every special attacker ever, Blissey. So I go for Toxic, so that way my opponent can't just stay in with Blissey, and I will either get my Toxic in first, which I felt was important, or we would Toxic each other at the same time, worst case scenario. My opponent went for Seismic Toss instead, and I hit the Toxic, so I couldn't have asked for a better exchange. However, I give up the small advantage I had here by staying into Thunderbolt again, and my opponent gets off the Toxic on my Zapdos. In hindsight, I'm really not sure why I stayed in, as there was no reason to switch Blissey out yet, especially if my opponent didn't want to reveal another team member. So here I go back to Crobat, just in case my opponent decided to get cute and Toxic again, predicting the switch. Even though in hindsight, 2 of the team members I've revealed are immune to Toxic. But my opponent switches out and goes back to Jirachi. So this puts me kind of in a bad spot, since my opponent now has momentum again. So I have to switch since Zen Headbutt would obviously one-hit KO Crobat at that range. So I go back to Jirachi and my opponent locks into Zen Headbutt, not wanting to predict. So based on what my opponent has revealed so far though, I decided to lock in the Thunder Punch. If my opponent was predicting Fire Punch and switches to Gyarados, I can get the one-hit KO. Thunder Punch also had pretty good neutral coverage in the meta at the time, but my opponent instead reveals a Dragonite. And I decided that now's the time to go ahead and sack Crobat to scout what set my opponent is running on Dragonite. Extreme Speed gets revealed and there's no Life Orb recoil, but Crobat still gets knocked out, which means that it's Choice Band. So I pick up on this and bring Jirachi back in on the free switch. My opponent decides to stay in and gets a crit on the Extreme Speed, which is unfortunate. I have to lock into Ice Punch here as CB Dragonite is a huge offensive threat and Jirachi and Dragonite 4-hit KO each other in this particular scenario if I lock into Thunder Punch. So Dragonite would likely KO Jirachi first even without the crit. But my opponent brings Gyarados back in. Zapdos is the only other Mon on this team that can force Gyarados out in this particular situation, so I go to it. I felt there was no reason to reveal a full health Venusaur yet, but my opponent makes a pretty nice prediction and goes for the Stone Edge off the bat, and he does connect. And this situation is interesting because Zapdos is still around, which means that Gyarados is likely the standard bulky Dragon Dance set. I'm running the standard specially defensive Zapdos, so we're looking at a speed tie there. So my opponent didn't even want to chance it though and just goes back to Blissey, and I just go for the speed tie with Thunderbolt since I can survive one turn of Toxic. And here I roost up and my opponent shows the last move you would ever see on a Blissey, Defense Curl, which is actually a problem to my main sweeper. So Blissey absolutely can't stay in. So here I decide to go directly to Venusaur right now. I figured I could outboost Blissey since I'm a Swords Dance set, and I'm also carrying Sleep Powder. And my opponent does stay in, as I expect, and goes to +2. Now here I'm just going to go for the Sleep Powder, and I do connect fortunately, but there's no way I can go for Swords Dance here despite Blissey taking a nap because Scarf Jirachi will easily check Venusaur. So here I decide to just go for Earthquake, hoping to catch Jirachi on the switch, but my opponent makes the smarter play and actually decides to reveal the last Mon, which is Breloom. Breloom as the last Mon isn't too surprising as Firewater Grass cores were still popular at the time. Unfortunately in DPPLU, Spore can put grass types to sleep, so I have to switch out. Thankfully Zapdos having Toxic status is pretty good here, so I go to it, and sure enough my opponent goes for the Spore. Now the most popular Breloom set at the time was the Substitute Focus Punch set. Because of that I decided to go for the Heat Wave to keep my opponent honest. And unsurprisingly, Blissey comes back in to tank it. The switch seemed pretty obvious, but going for Toxic would have been awful if my opponent decided to get cute and stay in to show that Breloom also had Stone Edge, which is highly unlikely, but it's still possible. Now I figured I can take another turn of Toxic damage, so I decide to roost again, and my opponent goes for the obligatory Seismic Toss. But here we're at the point now where Roost basically has diminishing returns. So I switch out and reveal my last, which is Infernape. Infernape was the other reason I was playing around Gyarados so carefully, despite having Zapdos and Jirachi for it. And my opponent goes for the Seismic Toss again, but I know here Gyarados is absolutely coming back in, as it's the perfect Infernape counter. So I decide to U-turn out, planning to bring Jirachi back in to check it, and sure enough, Gyarados does show up. And as you guys can see, that explosion on Swampert turn 2 turned out to be big. Gyarados has been able to come in freely due to no Stealth Rock on my opponent's side of the field the whole game. I'm going for U-turn here, predicting the switch I felt was too dangerous, so I lock in the Thunder Punch again, as the only real resist left is Breloom, who I have 2 switches for. And my opponent goes back to Jirachi. And the only move my opponent's Jirachi has used the whole game is Zen Headbutt. Iron Head's a given, but at the time I felt Fire Punch was definitely still possible, as Fire Psychic is pretty good coverage, and Scarf Jirachi is never going to fight Heatran 1v1. Because of this, as much as I hate to, since Breloom is still around, I decide to still sack Zapdos. My opponent locks in the Iron Head. Now here I could have gone back to Jirachi, as I was decently high enough in HP to tank a few Iron Heads and force some speed ties. I think staying in with Zapdos here was not necessarily bad, but it wasn't wrong either. I mean, not necessarily good, but it wasn't incorrect either. And I'm going to put the calcs for Iron Head on Scarfrachi on the screen. Just let me know in the comments what you guys would have done. The flinch on the first Iron Head allowed my opponent to get the 2-hit KO, so I brought Infernape in on the free switch, and here I just felt I was behind enough, so I decided to just ball out and just go for it. I just stopped caring about Gyarados at this point. Infernape is also pretty much the weakest team member left. As big of a threat as it is, my opponent's never going to allow Infernape to dish out serious damage to his team since his defensive Gyarabliss core is still intact. So I went for Overheat, expecting to take a chunk off Gyarados' health, which happens. I stay into close combat, and I just wanted to get as much damage on Gyarados as I can and just hope I can deal with it between Scarf, Rachi, and Venusaur. My opponent went for Dragon Dance, and then I believe made a misplay by going for the Waterfall immediately. If my opponent decided to go for the second Dragon Dance instead, then he wouldn't have been able to outspeed Jirachi and one-hit KO it with Waterfall cleanly. But because he was at +1, I was able to still check him with Scarf Rachi, and not only that, my opponent decided to stay in with Gyarados, and I outspeed it and get the KO with Thunder Punch, which is huge. So my opponent brings Blissey back in on the free switch. This gives me a pretty good chance to win the game now. I can win with either Venusaur or Jirachi. So I bring Venusaur in. I go ahead and go for the Swords Dance on the defense curl. My opponent goes for the Seismic Toss, which did spook me a little bit. So I switch up and decide to go for Sleep Powder. And now Swords Dance Venusaur has his chance to shine. Here I go for Earthquake for the guaranteed damage and the chance to nail Jirachi on the switch. And my opponent does go to Jirachi expecting the Power Whip, and Jirachi gets put 6 feet under like a Dugtrio. Now Breloom comes in. Earthquake is a clean 2-hit KO on Breloom at that range, assuming the Sub Punch set. But that means Breloom gets a hit in, and any damage on Venusaur is bad at this point. So I go for the 1-hit KO with Power Whip, and it connects. Now all I need to do is hit this Sleep Powder, and I essentially win the game. I go for it, it connects, and my opponent forfeits. So a pretty good showing for Swords Dance Venusaur in DPP OU. The only real threats to it are things that resist both grass and ground, so mons like Skarmory and Celebi pose problems. Scizor can also be a problem too, albeit less so. It's a pretty good set. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed. If you guys liked what you saw, hit that like button just below the video. It helps me out immensely when you do. If you didn't like it, then hit the dislike button, but let me know in the comments as to why. If you guys don't want to miss the future stuff coming down the pipe, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Links to all the social clubs I hang out at are in the description box below. Twitter, Google+, all that good stuff. Anyway, stay tuned for more. And until next time, Mully is out. Take care, guys. Peace.